The moderators for the third GOP presidential debate have been announced. The NBC-hosted showdown will be led by Lester Holt and Kristen Welker of NBC News, and Hugh Hewitt, former Reagan administration official and regular Fox News political commentator. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy, and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie are the four candidates who have qualified for the debate, the campaigns told Axios. To qualify, candidates must poll at least 4% in two national polls or 4% in a national poll and one early state poll after September 1st.
The debate is set to take place on Wednesday, November 8th in Miami, Florida, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. You might remember the host Kristen Welker, who hosted the final debate of the 2020 presidential election between the incumbent Republican President Donald Trump and now President and former Vice President Joe Biden. A recent 538 poll has Donald Trump with 56.9% of the vote, DeSantis with 14.1%, Haley with 8%, Ramaswamy with 5.8%, and Christie with 3.1%. So Christie maybe got lucky getting some of those polls at least 4%. I'm curious, what do you make of this current pool of candidates as someone who's a conservative? What do you make of Ramaswamy, Haley, DeSantis, Trump, and I guess Christie as well?
At this point, the primary is Trump's to lose, right? I mean, the idea that any of these four candidates are going to leverage their way up to Trump's level on this debate stage, I think is pretty ridiculous. Now, that's not to say that there shouldn't be a primary process. That's obviously the fair thing to do, to let the voters decide. But if the polling is even half correct, then Trump is running away with this thing, and all of this is really just a formality. I'm really troubled by the fact that the Republican National Committee decided to pick Lester Holt and Kristen Welker to moderate this debate. These are not fair journalists. These are people who have shown themselves to be biased towards the Democratic Party, whether it was Lester Holt's antagonistic attacks on former President Donald Trump in the debates in 2016, or whether it was Kristen Welker during Trump's debate with Biden in 2020. She actually cut off former President Donald Trump from talking about the Hunter Biden laptop, claiming that it wasn't verified, which was absolutely patently false. The laptop was verified and has been so since then by the Washington Post and the New York Times. But she wouldn't even let him talk about it on the debate stage. And it was really the first time that he had the opportunity to bring that message directly to the public. She also claimed in a recent interview with Trump that no Democrats have supported abortion up until the moment of birth, which is another lie, because Kathy Tran in Virginia, a state delegate, had introduced a bill that would allow exactly that, and that bill was then supported by Virginia Governor Ralph Northam. So the idea that she's going to give any of these candidates a fair shake is ridiculous, and the idea that the RNC should be having their primary process perhaps tainted by left-wing biased journalists, I think is absurd. The primary process is for the Republican voters, the Republican base, to hear about the issues that matter to them. And unfortunately, at the last debate, we had the same issue where we had a Univision reporter asking biased questions that had nothing to do with the interest of the Republican voters and ultimately distracted from these candidates' ability to make their case to conservatives and the issues that they care about. So I don't even see that a lot of Republican voters are going to tune into this debate, because they probably have the foregone conclusion that it's going to be an attempt to knock all of these candidates down in anticipation of a general election, as opposed to actually getting information for primary voters.
It's a really interesting perspective and a big problem, how much power media has to determine how primaries go, not just being able to ask the questions for the debates, but also being able to control how many stories each candidate gets, what their coverage looks like, if it's a household name or not. For a person to vote for one candidate over another in a primary is a big factor, and the mainstream media has the power to determine that. I think the internet is changing some of that dynamic, but I think a better host would probably be someone like Andy Cohen. And if you don't know who that is, Andy Cohen is the host who delivers the very good confessionals. I don't know if you can call it that, but it's a convening of all of the members of the Real Housewives of whatever chapter of the Real Housewives across the country. And they all talk about all of the drama that happened that season. And he does a very good job facilitating the debate and actually giving everyone a chance to respond to the questions that are asked, which I think is something the American people are very hungry for. I think Andy Cohen should host a presidential debate. I think anyone but mainstream news commentators would be a good pick. I really think when we consider the democratic process, the debates are a huge part of that. And to have mainstream media fund them and put them on and determine the questions, it's a conflicting interest with the democracy and giving voters a fair chance to decide which candidate represents them the most.
Yeah, and Lester Holt, when he was given an Edward R. Murrow Award, said infamously that fairness is overrated. So he apparently ascribes to the school of journalism that believes that there's no such thing as covering both sides fairly, that journalists actually should pick a side based on what they determine the truth to be, as opposed to just presenting information to the public and allowing them to decide. And the other problem I have with this debate process is, why is this being held in Miami, Florida? That's home turf for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. You're basically giving him an unfair advantage, because when people watch these debates, one of the things that they're internalizing is the reaction from the crowd. Whether they should or not is a different question. We've talked about before how these crowds are pretty much overwhelmingly made up of both donors and staff members and otherwise political officials, as opposed to grassroots individuals and other, lower level voters, I guess you could say. And so when you have a debate that's being held in the home state of a current governor who is overwhelmingly popular, that debate hall is going to be filled probably with a lot of his supporters. And so he's going to get applause whether he deserves it or not, which could make the other candidates look negative even if they perform well. So I think that's just setting up an unfair situation. I have to wonder if the RNC did that intentionally. It would be a much more fair process, in my opinion, if they held these debates in various locations where none of these people had some kind of home field advantage. So having it in Miami is a problem. The moderators are a problem. I think there's a lot of reasons to be troubled as a conservative with how this whole thing is going down. Pivoting to another topic, Donald Trump came for the judge in his New York civil trial, saying in a Truth Social post that the judge has gone crazy in his hatred of Trump. Now, in this case, we have basically this judge claiming that Donald Trump has overvalued many of his properties for the sake of getting loans. And there have been questions raised thus far about the judge's own valuation of some of these properties, namely that he said Mar-a-Lago was only worth something like $18 million, even though the property alone would probably be worth something like $300 million. So I actually err on Trump's side here, that this judge is being incredibly unfair to him.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting statement, someone facing criminal accusations, to say this judge hates me. Donald Trump, I think, is getting a taste of how much power judges have in our criminal justice system. It's like rolling the dice which judge you get to hear your case, whether it's an arraignment or what have you. One judge can say, guess what? Same exact crime as another judge, but I'm going to put you in jail for 6 months, no cash bail. Another judge could, set bail at a very low number, and that same person could walk free. There's so much human decision making that goes into our judicial process. I don't think the answer to that is what a lot of people have said, and it's that we have AI replacing a lot of the decisions that are made by judges now, so we have some consistency. I think the human element is important, but I think we've got to be a lot more careful about how we appoint federal judges. I think the confirmation process for federal judges needs to be more robust in a democracy. I think Trump, probably feels this way because things didn't go in his favor in the initial hearing in this case. And I think he's got a lot of legal troubles happening right now and probably has a general distaste for our judicial system and penal system as a whole. But I think as someone who appointed many federal judges, he's now getting a taste of his own medicine and really seeing what it's like when you have these people with so much power making decisions that can determine the outcome of an election, but also his personal life. And him storming out of the courtroom this week, I think, is a demonstration of that frustration.
Yeah, I think it's also a reminder of the fundamental problem of what happens when we decide to prosecute political opponents and the necessary bias that comes in through that process. And Trump is definitely bearing the brunt of that in quite a few of these indictments that we, of course, will be following here at Rising. We'll be back with more after this.